Okay, I think you should be good to go.
All right, so I have 6:28. Should we hang a couple minutes or go ahead and start?
Go ahead and start because there's a 2 or 3 minute delay on YouTube.
Okay. All right, well, we're here tonight to talk about alternative gardening spaces. And I'm Diana Alfuth. I'm a horticulture outreach specialist for the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension. And I'm over in the western part of the state in Pierce and St. Croix counties, but I serve the bigger region here. And I really want to thank our libraries for putting this together and making this possible. So the Library Consortium really is helpful with making this accessible to everybody, specifically the libraries in Augusta and Amory and Clear Lake and Ellsworth. So I want to thank them for hosting this and putting the recording up and all of that stuff, because it's springtime and I'm getting a lot of phone calls about different kinds of gardening and different ways to get into gardening. And even though the snow has melted and it was a beautifully warm day out there today, there's still a lot of time to get ready before we actually start planting, and we really don't want to get out there too quickly. So most of the time we're talking about vegetable gardening in ground and soil amendments and things like that, but not everybody has that kind of space. So a couple of ways that have become a little popular lately to garden are raised beds and straw bales and lasagna gardening and pallet gardening, which I'll also talk about here. So we're just going to look at some of the pros and cons and alternative ways to garden. The thing is, it doesn't matter how you garden or where you garden, as long as you garden, because gardening is so great, but not everybody has the same setup. So there's not necessarily one best way. It's whatever works best for you in your situation. So maybe this is not your garden space. Maybe you don't want a big, huge in-ground garden, and maybe you don't have the time for that kind of maintenance or the energy. But no matter where you garden or how you garden, plants need the same thing. They need the proper light. In the case of vegetables, that means full sun, which is at least 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. They need a healthy root zone. Most vegetable plants grow down their roots about 8 inches, and they need room to spread out, and they need good soil in that space. They need the correct watering. Vegetables use a lot of water compared to some of our perennial plants like trees and shrubs. And of course, they need adequate fertility, so the nutrients that they have to take out of the soil. So wherever you garden, as long as you provide all of these things for the plants, you can be successful and get a really good production. So to start, if you're thinking of gardening, make a list of all the vegetables or herbs or flowers that you want to grow, because that's what's going to help you determine the size of your garden, the location for your garden, and you might need to do some planning to be able to fit it all in. And you might need to look at alternatives. So maybe you have some in-ground garden space and you'll grow some of the crops there, and maybe you'll grow some in containers on your front porch, and maybe you'll try straw bale gardening in your back patio, or maybe it's going to be a combination of all of these things to get the vegetables and plants grown that you want to. And then prioritize that list. So what do you want the most, and where do you think you're going to have the best success? Those plants in there. And of course, there's a tomato picture here because almost everybody wants tomatoes that does vegetable gardening. So that may be your priority. And then look at your space options. So what's in your yard? Do you have a space where you could put an in-ground garden and it's going to get the full sun during the day, and it's not going to be outcompeted by tree roots, and it's not growing under a black walnut tree, because black walnuts prevent a lot of our vegetables from growing. So look at what you have available, and then make sure, like I said, if you're growing vegetables, make sure that you are sure that spot is going to get 6 hours of midday sunlight. So the sun between 6:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. doesn't really count because it's so weak, because it's at such a low angle. And the same with the sun from like 6 p.m. till sunset. That sun is pretty weak as well. So make sure that you watch the area and that during the day you're getting at least 6 hours in the middle of the day, and you don't have tree branches. Right now the trees aren't leafed out, so you don't see the big shadows, but make sure that you don't have a lot of shade hitting that spot during the middle of the day. And if you don't have an in-ground space for it, that's when you start looking at containers and raised beds and mobile gardens on wagons that you can move across your driveway during the day so you can follow the sunlight. And but one way or another, you can grow some vegetables. You just got to figure out where you're going to get the right sun. So let's start with raised beds, because there is a lot of interest in raised beds. And raised beds are often thought of as small space gardening, but they're not necessarily small space. And you can see this picture here of a whole bunch of raised beds with really cool paths in. It's got bunny fencing around it, so the wildlife doesn't get in. There's some mesh fencing inside that cute picket fencing. Raised beds can have sides like these do, where there's wood framing each of the raised beds. There's a nice low maintenance path in between them with that pretty rock and stuff. So a lot of people like the looks of raised beds, but there are pros and cons to everything. So before you go spending a whole lot of effort and investment of money for building raised beds, make sure that you're fully aware of all of the concerns that you have to have with raised beds. So there are lots of raised bed kits available. You can buy things, commercial products that come in various sizes, various materials. There are a lot of them out there made with basically plastics or resins. There are plans on the internet. There are plans you can purchase for how to build things with wood. There are raised up ones like down here in the bottom left corner, which are really cool because you really can stand while you garden there. Or if someone has a disability and is in a wheelchair, they can roll up to those and still garden in those raised beds. So there are lots of options available. There is no one perfect setup, and everybody has to look at what's going to be best for them and look at what materials you have on hand to build it. So in the bottom right here, there are logs. Okay, you had to cut down a dead ash tree or some tree that was encroaching on the space. Hey, if this was a shaded spot, you cut down the tree and you use it to build your raised bed in the now full sun area, right? So this is going to rot over time. All wood will decay. There are some concerns with using treated lumber, but it's not as big of a concern as it used to be, because up till about 20 years ago, treated lumber had arsenic in it. And then they found that, well, that arsenic leaches into the soil a little bit, and then you're getting it on your skin, and kids are in there and stuff. So they don't use arsenic in treated lumber anymore. And it should be just fine, but still some people are concerned. So you can use cedar, you can use redwood, which is really expensive. Those naturally don't decay as quickly, but a bed like this with these logs here, that's going to last for quite a few years, okay? And as it rots away, it's not going to hurt anything. So use what you have on hand. You can see in the top right here, this one has some fencing built right in and a nice little door to walk into. In the middle here, there's a little ledge so that you can sit there and weed your garden or harvest and reach in. So lots and lots of different options available. And again, you need to look at what you want and what's best for you. Now, I have some cons to raised beds, okay, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But one of my biggest concerns, because I have a background in landscape design and people are always asking for low maintenance landscapes. And these first two pictures here, the one in the middle and the one on the left. My concern is that's plunked in around grass, and now you have to string trim that grass up against those raised beds, and that's a big maintenance thing. So if you have it with some mulch around the raised beds or some other material, think about that. Don't just go plunk your raised bed in the middle of your lawn, because that can create more mowing issues. Your size considerations, again, it goes back to planning how much you want to grow, what your crops are that you want to grow, and how much space they need. Usually with raised beds, what one of the main advantages to raised beds is you make them no more than 4 to 4.5 feet wide, and then you can reach in from the side and do all of the maintenance that you need to do. And that means that you don't have to step into the garden soil. So every time that you step on your garden soil, you compact it, you squish out air and you squish out water, and that makes for a less hospitable growing spot for your plant's roots. So we don't want to compact the soil, and that's one of the great advantages to raised beds. If you make them 4 feet wide, you can reach in. How long you make them is totally up to you, or how many of these beds you make is totally up to you. But don't make them 6 or 7 feet wide, a big square, and then you have to crawl into them in order to get in and do your stuff. Also think about if you have more than one bed, if you're like in that last pictures, if you've got multiple beds, think about how far apart you space them based on your equipment that you're going to be using. If you're going to be using a little wheelbarrow to go in between the beds to do the garden cleanup, to haul out the debris at the end of the year, or haul in compost or things like that, how wide is your wheelbarrow? Make sure that you're spacing your beds far enough apart so that you can get in between there. If you use an ATV or a gator or something to wheel in between your raised beds, make sure that your beds are wide enough for that. So really think this out, because once you go through all the time and effort of building these things, you're not going to be moving them. So planning ahead of time is really, really important. Now, the pros to raised bed gardens is that when you are working in there, you don't have to bend over as far. Okay, so you can see the picture on the right here. She's kneeling down. Okay, again, there's a little bit of a ledge on the edge of this bed, so you could actually sit there for a little bit and lean in. So it saves on your back. It saves on your muscles to be bending over as you would to an flat in the ground bed. The other advantage is that in the spring, this time of year, that soil warms up faster because it's above ground. It'll dry out faster from the snow melt and warm up faster. And so you can usually plant in that bed a little bit sooner than you would if it was just in the ground gardening. You can also make beautiful soil in there, because you have to fill that bed with something. So you can bring in great topsoil and compost and make a really nice fluffy soil, versus if your native soil in your yard is hard pan clay or super sandy or something that's not so great, your raised bed could be really a lot better from that standpoint to be growing your vegetables. And because you have this raised bed that you can easily reach into, you can plant it pretty intensely. So you don't need to do rows in between to access it like you might in an in-ground garden. And you can manage it a little bit more. So you can maybe space things a little bit closer, although we always got to remember the problems with diseases. So we want good air circulation, and we can't have the plants competing with each other. So you might be able to plant them a little more intensely, but don't overdo it. Now, the cons, the disadvantages to raised beds are that you can't use a rototiller in them in most cases. So in the right-hand picture here, if you wanted to use a rototiller to work up your soil or work compost in or something, you would have to lift that rototiller up into the bed and then start it up and do your little rototilling. And I will tell you from experience that you end up kicking a whole bunch of soil off over the edge onto your path. So now you have soil down on that path, and if you've used rocks or some kind of nice mulch and stuff, now you got a bit of a mess. So you really can't use a rototiller. Maybe one of those really little tiny cultivator kinds of things could work in there, but even that flings the soil around a lot. Now we really don't encourage a lot of rototilling because it can destroy your soil structure. And with this bed, if you've got nice organic matter and good soil in there, it's not going to be that difficult to either flip over with a spade or a spading fork sort of a thing, or using a no-till method of planting in there. But again, if your preferred method of getting your seed bed ready in the spring is with a rototiller, raised beds are kind of hard. Now, raised beds do not have to have sides on them. So this one on the right has the wooden sides on it, but you'll see on the left that these are raised beds, but they're just mounded up soil. Okay, they're a little trench dug that's kind of built up the soil. Compost and other amendments have been added, so the bed is raised up. Now it's not super high, so you still have a lot of bending to do, but it will warm up a little faster in the spring. It will drain a little faster in the spring, and it's easily accessible. Now they've got the grass in between the raised beds, which will need mowing, and that's okay. Shooting grass clippings on that soil is fine. That'll add a few nutrients and that sort of thing, so that's not a problem. You don't have to string trim around it like you do if you have hard sides, but it's another way to use raised beds. Now, the other negatives for raised beds is they dry out faster. So just like in the spring, they dry out faster and you can plant in them sooner. In the middle of summer, when it's hot, they dry out faster. So you're really going to need to manage the irrigation or the watering or hopefully rainfall better, because they will dry out faster. And of course, you need to have soil to fill these raised beds. So if you fill a raised bed, you need to find or source soil to load it up with. Now, you might have some on site, or you're going to have to go buying soil and compost to fill your bed up. Ideally, if you're starting a bed and you're filling it up, ideally you would have about 2/3 topsoil and 1/3 compost. Now, where you get that topsoil depends on if you have anything available or you go to a landscaping company, but you can technically fill it all with compost. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we start talking about lasagna gardening. But topsoil is actually sand, silt, or clay. So those are the actual mineral particles, and they tend to hold nutrients better. They bring a lot of nutrients. They buffer the pH, and they give it some stability, because the soil, whatever you put in that raised bed, is going to settle throughout the growing season as it gets rained on and that sort of thing, and as the organic matter in there decomposes. So if you fill it all with compost, it's going to settle even more than if you have some topsoil in there. And again, compost might be hard to come by, depending on how much you need, and it might be more expensive. So as long as you get a 2/3, 1/3 balance in there, that's a good place to start. And the ideal thing would be that you fill up that raised bed. Either you built it in the fall and you fill it up, or you build it early in the spring and fill it up, and let that compost and topsoil work together a little bit, and kind of some decomposition will happen. The microbes will get going in there. And after a few weeks, do a soil test and send the soil test into the lab. And that's going to tell you what your pH is, if you need any adjustment that way. It'll tell you if you have any phosphorus or potassium deficiencies. And it's a really good idea to know where you're starting with your newly filled raised bed. Raised beds, again, because they are narrow, no more than 4 feet wide, And because they cost money to build, if you're putting sides on them and buying soil to fill them, they're a precious gardening space, okay? And so think about growing vertically. You can use different kinds of trellises, like are in some of these pictures here, to make sure that things go up rather than ramble over the sides of those raised beds. So if you look on the left side here, if you had vine crops like squash or cucumbers and you don't have trellises for them to grow upward, then they're going to ramble over the side and onto the grass. And now it's going to be even harder to mow that grass. They might shade out some of that grass, and then the grass isn't going to be doing well. And even on the right side here, if you have mulch in between the beds, that's where you want to walk and push your wheelbarrow and pull your hoses and stuff. So having things rambling over the edges of the raised beds all of a sudden becomes a maintenance problem. So think about anything that you'll be growing that will want to sprawl, and make sure that you cage it or trellis it up. Again, there are gazillions of different ways that you can build trellises. You might have things on hand. There are commercial things. You can find all kinds of ideas all over the internet. You can use tomato cages, even if it's not a tomato. You can let cucumbers grow up tomato cages and use them as vine trellises and stuff. But make sure that you're thinking vertical, because again, if everything rambles over the edges of those raised beds, now you've got an issue. Okay. And also, as I mentioned, raised beds do dry out faster because they're above ground, so they're getting more air circulation. And those sides that are exposed to the air rather than just right into the ground can dry out as well. So make sure that you have figured out how you're going to water this. Now, this is a situation, this picture shows a soaker hose that's been wound through that raised bed in between the pepper and tomato plants and things that are in that bed. And then when it comes time to water, all you do is you pull your hose over and you hook it up to the end of the soaker hose and let it run for a while. Stick your finger in there and see when it's wet enough, and then you'll be done. And then unhook the hose and go put it on the next one. This is the best way to water a raised bed. You don't want to be using an overhead sprinkler. Not only do we want to make sure, especially when we're talking about tomatoes that get tomato blights and funguses that fungi that cause diseases, we want to make sure the leaves stay dry as much as possible. So overhead watering is really bad from a disease standpoint. Not only that, in a raised bed, it would be really hard to keep a sprinkler watering just this raised bed. It's going to go off into the path, so you're wasting water in the path, and so that's not a good thing. So if you're going to hand water and just come out every night with the hose and water everything, that's one option. It takes a little more time maybe, or using a soaker hose like this is a really good thing to do with raised beds. So I want to talk a little bit about companion planting, because this is another thing that often people are asking about. And there are a lot of myths out there about, oh, if you plant this plant next to this plant, you won't have certain insects or you won't have certain diseases. And if only it was that simple. It's really not. But companion planting has a lot of different definitions. And so it might mean that you're planting plants in your space that are companionable based on their sizes. Okay, so for example, you plant a tall plant in the back part, and then you plant your, let's say you plant corn, and then you plant squash, and it can ramble around in between the squash plant or between the corn plants. So they're utilizing the space, okay? You might be companion planting or planting two plants in the same area based on their harvest time. So for example, you plant your peas early in the year because they're a cool season plant. And by the time you're harvesting them, you've already planted your warm season eggplants or something in that area. So then you're taking out the peas after they're done with harvest, and then you've got that space there for your eggplant or tomatoes or something. You might also be thinking about the needs, the space needs of each individual plant based on the time of the year. Okay, so like little lettuces don't need a lot of space, whereas the big viney crops do. But a lot of times we hear about companion planting from the standpoint of, like I say, pest deterrence. That's not true. Okay. There's no research out there that really shows that there's anything that you can plant one plant next to another and it's going to protect another plant. Okay. So it would be nice if there was. I see recommendations like planting onions next to tomatoes and you won't get tomato blight. Well, that's absolutely not true, because tomato blight is a soil-borne thing. If the humidity is high, it's going to get on a tomato leaf and it's going to cause disease. And having onions nearby does nothing for that. And insects, plant garlic next to beans and you won't have flea beetles. No, you won't have flea beetles on the garlic because they don't like that. But your garlic has to be far enough away from your beans that things aren't competing with each other, and nothing really gives off that aura that's going to protect another plant from a disease or insect. Now, there is one situation, and that is and there's even a book, I think, called Tomatoes Love Marigolds, or Marigolds Love Tomatoes, or something. And there is evidence and research that shows that there's a specific nematode, which is a microscopic little worm that attacks tomato plant roots. And it's been shown that some compounds that are exuded from marigold roots actually kill those nematodes. Okay, so the idea is you can't necessarily plant the tomatoes and the marigolds right together because they're going to compete with each other and stuff. But the idea is that where you planted tomatoes last year, you could now plant marigolds, and it would wipe out that nematode population so that next year you can plant tomatoes there again. The only thing is that we don't really have that nematode issue going on in Wisconsin. That's more of a southern thing. So there's no reason to plant tomatoes and marigolds together. Some people claim that the marigolds will keep rabbits out of the garden, and others say that the rabbits eat the marigolds down and then go in for the beans and tomatoes and everything else. So I'm not saying don't try it. Go ahead and try it, but try it at least for several years to see if it wasn't just a fluke, because that is how a lot of these things get started, that the rabbits just, the coyote population went up and the rabbit population went down that year, and it had nothing to do with the marigolds keeping them out of the garden. But don't be looking for plants to help prevent a disease or insect on another plant. Now, having said that, there is some validity in hiding a desirable plant in the midst of plants that you don't like. And one of the problems that we create is we plant large monocultures. So then the pest insect is like, wow, this is a great place to go. So if we plant like a row of a desirable plant, a plant that's desirable to an insect, for example, and then all around it, we plant something that insect doesn't like, it's going to be harder for that pest insect to find that plant in the middle of the less desirable things, because a lot of times insects find their food by landing, flying a little more, landing, flying a little more, landing. So there are differences that we can do in planting, but if we're planting just a small household vegetable garden, we probably don't have a lot of space for things like that. So, so companion planting, don't get your hopes up for it. Diseases and insects have to be managed in other ways. So another form of companion planting, like I mentioned, is interplanting. So planting two different crops together. So they might germinate at different times. They might reach harvestable size differently. And you might use, they might use a different space vertically. So you might be familiar with the Three Sisters planting that Native Americans did. They planted corn. Then they planted pole beans at the base of the corn, and the pole beans used the stalks of the corn to grow upward. And then they planted squash near the base, and that rambled along the ground, kept out weeds, and used, again, a different plane for it to have the foliage and collecting the sunlight and doing its thing. So there are ways to think about that. Some of our fast harvesting plants like lettuce and radishes can easily be planted in with some of our later harvesting plants like tomatoes and beans and such, and that way you can make the most of the space. And this is especially important if you're doing a small space gardening, like a raised bed like we were talking about earlier. You can also plant things based on light requirements. So there are some things like lettuce that don't like the heat of summer, but they need full sun. But when you get into the really hot sun of July, then they kind of scorch and they set seed and that sort of thing. So if you plant in front of them, meaning to the south of the lettuce, when that lettuce gets up and growing and it gets all the full sunlight, and then it might start getting a little bit of afternoon shade from a taller plant around it, and that might help with it. Containers, if you're growing in containers, interplanting is really, really good because, again, you can get some fast growing things like radishes out of a space before the tomato or whatever else is in that container gets growing up. And again, some examples might be lettuce along with staked up tomatoes. So you want those tomatoes staked up so they don't smother the lettuce. Spinach and trellised beans, so pole beans that are growing upwards. Radish and broccoli, they can both be planted early in the season when things are still cool and we might even still get some frost, but those radishes will be harvested before the broccoli needs the space. And then carrots and radishes are often planted together mainly because carrots are slow to germinate and they're tiny little plants, and so it's easy to lose them, especially amongst the weeds. So if you plant radishes, a radish seed every 5-6 inches along with your carrots, then you can pull out those radishes. You can help find your row of carrots, and then by the time the carrots need that space, the radishes are gone. Succession planting, again, is trying to plant plants that are going to be harvested at different times. So your cool season crops like lettuce and spinach and radishes and peas, by the time they're done, you can be planting more of those later in the year. So this is a way with small spaces to get more out of your garden. So you start planting again in July and August, and then those cool season crops really flourish in the fall when the days are getting shorter and the nights are getting cooler. So that's succession planting. And again, that's a form of companion planting. So now we're going to talk about straw bale gardening, because this is a gardening method that's kind of taken off. Well, it kind of became popular again about 15 years ago or so. And it is basically using a bale of straw to grow your garden instead of an in-ground garden or a container garden or a raised bed garden. So in some ways, a bale of straw is a raised bed, okay? But here's a picture of what a straw bale garden looks like. And these are some cucumbers that are getting started, and they're starting to ramble down the straw bed. So straw bale gardening, before we start talking about that and lasagna gardening, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, we have to go back to making sure that you understand composting, okay? So composting is usually we think of it as throwing all your garden scraps and kitchen scraps and things on a pile and getting it to break down into a nice soil amendment of organic matter that you would work into your soil. And it's great, okay? No one can ever get enough good compost, right? But in order for a compost pile to work, it has to have the proper ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And that ratio is typically somewhere around 30 to 1. So if we're talking parts per million of carbon to parts per million of nitrogen, it's 30 to 1. And the reason that's important is because decomposition or composting happens because stuff is decaying. It's being broken down, and it's being broken down by these guys down here on the right. Okay, microbes. There's all kinds of scary looking critters in the soil and in your compost, and they're eating that stuff and they're pooping it out. And then some other microbe in there is eating their poop and pooping that out. And eventually these, all the nutrients in the dead plants that were thrown on the pile are down to the form that your now desirable garden plants can take up, okay? So we need to always think about keeping that workforce of microbes happy. And that's in the carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 to 1. Now, we don't have labs on hand to measure all of our carbon nitrogen ratios in our yards, but the simplistic way to think of it is if you're building a compost pile, you want to throw on 3 scoops of brown stuff. And brown stuff is anything that's like older or drier. So it might be like dried leaves, dried grass clippings, straw, wood shavings, anything that's brown and dryish. And then you want to balance that with 1 shovelful or 1 part of green stuff. And green is fresh stuff. It's fresh kitchen scraps. Even if it's an orange peel, it's still considered green. Manure, fresher manure, fresh grass clippings, freshly pulled weeds that have not yet gone to seed. So when you're pulling those little 6-inch tall weeds and they're all just leaves, that's green stuff. So anything that's green is higher in nitrogen than something that's brown. And if you throw on, again, if you're building a compost pile, 3 parts brown to 1 part green, you're going to have your compost pile heat up nice. It heats up because the microbe population explodes and they give off heat as they reproduce and have a big population. And then as they're going about their business, they give off heat. And that's why your compost pile heats up. Okay. So this is something to just keep in mind as we talk about straw bale gardening and raised bed gardening. You need a good workforce and you need a carbon to nitrogen ratio around 30 to 1. So a straw bale, sometimes people ask me, well, what actually is a straw bale? So straw is the stems that held up a grain crop. So it could be oats, it could be barley, it could be rye, it could be wheat. It doesn't matter. Your straw bale garden, it can be from anything. Most of the time around Western Wisconsin, farmers grow oats for cattle feed. And so most of what we have is oat straw. And after they combine off these seed heads, what's left is the stalk that was holding up that seed head, and it's hollow like a straw, and that's what straw is. And it gets baled into a bale like this on the right. And typically those straws are going sideways. So there are strings, there are 2 strings that hold the bale like this. I don't know why my little drawing thing is shooting these lines out to the side, but the straws are going sideways, okay? You want clean straw. So what clean straw means is that these oats or whatever, when they were growing, didn't have a bunch of weeds in them, because you don't want to be bringing weed seed heads along with it. You also want to make sure that they did a good job of combining and you don't have seed stalks in this straw yet, because once you start growing your garden, they will sprout, okay? Most often we say you should use straw and not hay, because hay tends to have seed heads from grass that's in the hay, or weeds or alfalfa, but that's not always true. So if you know somebody who makes grassy horse hay and manages it really well, the second crop hay doesn't have any seed heads to it, and it could be just fine for using as a garden thing. But you want to look at it and make sure that you're not seeing weed seed heads, whether it's hay or straw. You need to start your straw bale garden at least 3 weeks before you want to plant in it. And that will depend on the temperature too. So if we have a cool spring, the conditioning that you need to do to get this bale ready to go might take longer. Okay. You place the bale on the edge so that the straws are going up and down. Okay, and then the strings will be going around it. You don't want the strings sitting on the ground. It'll rot quickly and break, and you want the straws going up and down. You need to put a high nitrogen fertilizer on that bale, so that the process would be to soak that bale nice and wet, get your hose, get it down in there. You want those straws to all get really wet and even hold some water, and then put a high nitrogen fertilizer on it. Now, the recommendations, there are lots of different recommendations out there. There's an actual book on it, but there are lots of other variations on that. And the idea is about 2 cups of a high nitrogen fertilizer in there. Now, if you use just a commercial garden fertilizer, 2 cups, you spread it all on there. If you're using an organic fertilizer like a fish emulsion or blood meal, you put a bunch on, okay? And it's hard to say exactly how much because each of those things has a different analysis. But what we're getting at here is the straw is a brown. So when we were talking about composting a minute ago, straw is really high carbon. We need to balance that with a lot of nitrogen in order to get the composting process started, because that's basically what you're doing. You're growing your plants in a composting straw bale. It has to be breaking down, releasing nutrients, and creating that root zone for your plants. That's why you need to start this 3 to 4 weeks in advance, because you need that process to have started. So a high nitrogen fertilizer, if you put your 2 cups on there, water it in good, and then every other day, you need to add some more fertilizer. You need to soak that bale daily. And then after a couple of days, you should be able to like stick your hand down in there and it should be feeling like it's warm. And that's the composting process starting. And if that's doing that, that means you're on the right track. If it's not getting warm in there, you need to add more fertilizer, more nitrogen, and make sure that you're getting it good and wet. Okay. Now, one of the concerns that I have with straw bales is I have seen straw bale gardens on people's lawns, and the bale is growing there and the grass right around the bales is tall and dark green. And then there's a green pathway down to the sewer. And that's telling us that there's a lot of nutrients washing out of that bale and it's getting down into the environment. So be really, really careful about that. Straw bale gardens take a lot of fertilizer, way more than you would be putting in your in-ground garden or your raised bed garden. You have to get that high nitrogen in there to counteract the carbon in that straw bale. So beware of that. Okay, so here are some pictures of some straw bale gardens, okay? And once your bale has started to decompose, you can plant your transplants like tomatoes, or you can put potatoes in there. You can plant any kind of transplants, peppers, right into that decomposing straw. If you want to plant seeds in there, usually you need to put a little layer of soil on top of that straw so that you can get that seed in that soil, keep that seed moist, and get it germinating well. Okay. As I said, with the raised beds, there's pros and cons to everything. And with straw bale gardening, it's the same thing. So straw bale gardening is not a magic panacea, okay? If you're thinking you're going to get bigger and better production than you would in an in-ground garden, that's probably not true. But it is an alternative if you don't have a good other option. Okay, so they are like a raised bed. You don't have to bend over as far. You can see these straw bales here are lined up on the grass. Obviously the grass under there is going to be dead after this. You can see the strings are going horizontally here because they've been placed on the edge. Okay, one of the advantages, you have no soil-borne diseases. So if your vegetable garden has been plagued with tomato diseases and you just haven't been able to get that under control, and you don't want to put your tomatoes in there for a couple of years to clean that out, then straw bales might be a good option because there's no soil-borne diseases coming in. Although by the end of the year, stuff can blow in and get in there. You can put it on a driveway or a patio or something, or if you have hard pan area, maybe you have some soil that was contaminated or something, you can put the straw bales on top of that. And then you shouldn't have any weeds in it. So that's one of the things that is touted about straw bale gardening is no weeds. However, as I mentioned earlier, if there are some leftover straw seed heads in that, or oat seed heads in that straw, they will sprout and you'll get this tall grass stuff growing up. Now, granted, they're easy to pull out, but if that straw was not clean and had other weeds in it, you can get some weeds in there. The cons are that you can only use this bale for 1 year. And while sometimes it's said, oh, it's a nice inexpensive way to garden, that may or may not be the case depending on where you source your bales from. So if you're in town and you're trying to buy some straw bales and you don't know a farmer that makes them, the garden centers are charging a lot of money for it because it has kind of become a thing to do. So sometimes straw bales are $10, $12, $15 for one bale. And that bale is what, 2 feet by 5 feet or something. That could be more expensive, especially since you can only use it for 1 year, than perhaps getting a plastic Rubbermaid tote and filling it with potting mix that you can use for more than 1 year. It also needs a lot of fertilizer and water. So they're pretty high maintenance from the standpoint that you need to get out there every day and soak that. You can't go a day without watering, not when you're conditioning it and not when you're growing your crops in it, because their sides are exposed to the wind and the sun and they will dry out fast. They're heavy. You can't move them around once you started. If you have to transport them home and you don't have a truck, they make a mess in your back seat. They rot away. Okay, that's the whole goal of it. They're decomposing. So they're not necessarily attractive depending on where you put them, especially by the end of the year. And at the end of the year, you've got a big pile of rotting straw to get rid of. Now, you might have a good place to put that on a compost pile, for example, but it's something to consider. The amount of production that you get out of them for the space, it is an intense gardening kind of a thing, like the raised bed garden, but you're not necessarily going to get, twice the harvest than you would in a raised bed or an in-ground garden. And then we do have to be concerned about that runoff, like I talked about. This picture on the right side here, as you soak that, if the nutrients run down to that sidewalk and then down the sidewalk to the sewer system, that's an environmental pollutant. So you got to be really careful about where all that fertilizer is going. And that brings us to lasagna gardening. So straw bale gardening is not it's not that difficult. Okay, so don't make it more difficult than it is. Once you get your bale conditioned, you plant on the top. You can plant some things into the sides even. As long as those roots are staying wet and they're getting fertilizer, you're going to be growing the plants. Now, what often I definitely suggest you try straw bale gardening if you haven't and you're interested in it. I'm not saying don't do it. However, a lot of people do not have success with it. And usually that's because they didn't condition them right and they didn't get enough fertilizer in there. So I've seen a lot of straw bale gardens with really yellow plants in them, and yellow leaves is a sign of nitrogen deficiency. So if that's what's happening, if you've got light green or yellowing leaves, you've got to get more nitrogen in there. Okay. Now, lasagna gardening is kind of related because basically what lasagna gardening is creating a flat compost pile that you're going to grow plants in. It's often also called sheet composting. So because rather than just throwing all of your stuff on a compost pile and then letting it compost and then moving that compost to somewhere, you're basically creating a compost bed that you're going to plant in. And you're going to build it like you would making lasagna. So you can see here on the left that you would start out with on the ground, you might have grass down there already. Depending on what's there, if it's grass or weeds, you might want to put down a layer of cardboard or paper or something that's going to help to smother anything that's there so that it doesn't grow up through your lasagna bed. Otherwise, make sure you're building your bed tall enough, and I'm meaning, 1.5 feet tall so that it totally smothers out anything that's underneath it. And basically what you're doing now is you're going to put on layers. And it's the same thing that we talked about earlier. You need to keep that carbon to nitrogen ratio in mind as you're throwing your layers on. So you might start with cardboard, then you might put on a layer of straw or leaves, and that layer should be a good 6 inches thick. Okay, don't just scatter a little bit on there, or you're not really going to have layers. You can put it on however much you want, maybe 6 to 8 inches. Any deeper than that is probably too thick of a layer. And then you might throw on some manure if you have that available. You might throw on some green grass clippings. You might throw on some finished compost. You might throw in some a thin layer, and we're talking maybe like 1 inch of topsoil if you have it available. And then you repeat those layers all the way up. Now, you don't want to actually use lasagna materials, because whether it's in a regular compost pile or a lasagna garden, you never want to use like cheese or meat or anything like that. It all has to be vegetative, and the manure needs to be from a vegetarian animal. So horses, cattle, chickens, that sort of thing. So never dog or cat poop or anything like that. So you put on as many layers as you want. And remember, this is composting, so it's going to settle. So build it taller rather than shorter. And you want to start this ahead of time. Now, ideally, you would start it in fall, the year before you're going to plant. So if you'd have started it last fall, you'd be kind of close to being ready this spring. But you can still build these this spring. You just need to make sure that you're paying good attention to that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that you give it some time to condition similar to the straw bale did. Okay, this is a really good thing for areas with poor soil. So let's say you have sandy soil or hard pan soil or something like that. And you're actually, it's not something you're going to scoop up and remove ever. You're basically creating an in-ground garden that's going to be there for years, but you're starting it off with these lasagna materials. So you can, or if you want, you can put on sides just like your lasagna pan, but you don't need to. So you can basically do a raised bed and fill it with all the layers rather than getting topsoil and compost in there like I talked about earlier. Or you can just build it up like down here in the bottom right picture and top it all off. This is built up here in the fall, so it'll be planted in spring then. Remember, again, this stuff is going to decompose. Those microbes are going to get busy, and it's going to settle significantly throughout the growing season. So every year you're likely to add more layers up on it. So you might add 6 or 8 inches of a couple different layers of stuff in the fall after garden cleanup so that it's ready the next year. And this stuff, though, as it's decomposing, especially the carbon stuff in there, remember, it's going to be using nitrogen. So monitor your plants. If they're looking a little yellow, you might need to put some extra nitrogen fertilizer on your lasagna garden. For making the size, it would be just like raised beds, ideally a 4-foot width so that you can reach in there. Be sure, as I mentioned, if there were any weeds there before you built it, you want to get those under control. You don't want those growing up into your lasagna bed and being a problem. Throwing some topsoil in there as you're building your layers, like I said, an inch here and then an inch a little bit later, helps because topsoil, again, that sand, silt, and clay holds on to nutrients good, and it'll help with the settling, being a little less, that sort of a thing. And over time, whatever your soil was underneath your lasagna bed, and your lasagna stuff is going to kind of get worked together a little bit by worms and things that are down in the soil. So you're actually creating a deeper, good quality soil profile underneath that lasagna garden. So I just want to mention real quick pallet gardens, because this is another thing that people have tried. If you have an old pallet sitting around, you can put some landscape fabric on the backside, staple it on, fill your pallet with some potting mix, and then plant in between the slats. And you can get some really, really good production of things like lettuce and beans. Probably not enough space for growing tomatoes or vine crops, but herbs and spinach, and even some flowers. And after you have it flat on the ground for a little while, you can, and it's established, then you can lean it up against something. So maybe you only have some sunlight hitting a wall of a shed or something, and this is still a way that you can get a garden going. As you look for a pallet, try to find one that has HT stamped on it. That means it was heat treated to kill any pests or things that are in there, versus a chemical treatment on there. Make sure you remove any staples or nails that are sticking out. Try to get not a rickety old pallet, but a newer one. And again, you plant it in between those slats and stuff grows up, and you don't have any weeding or anything, and you can just water it daily to keep the root zone wet, and you can really have some attractive things, as well as get some production of vegetables in a small space. And this is really useful if you've got some limited sunlight area. Okay. So as I said, it doesn't matter how you garden or where you garden, as long as you garden, because gardening is so good for us. And these are all some options. But if you have questions, you can always contact me. Okay, there's my phone number and my email address. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions. The biggest thing with straw bale gardening and lasagna gardening is, again, don't make it too complicated, but remember that carbon to nitrogen ratio, because you want it to be composting. You want that straw bale to be breaking down and releasing nutrients. You're going to need a lot of fertilizer to counteract that carbon in there. In a lasagna garden, you don't need as much fertilizer, because all of the different layers that you're putting in there, you're going to be able to work in some green things that have nitrogen in it. Okay. In the straw bale, you're creating the compost, but the nitrogen fertilizer is actually the green that you would be putting into your compost pile. So give it a try, see if it works for you. It's, like I say, it's kind of fun. It might be a fun thing to do with kids as well. And whatever garden works best for you is what you should do. So that wraps it up for tonight. Again, I want to thank the libraries in Augusta and Amory and Clear Lake and Ellsworth for hosting this. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions.